Nick, how are you doing today?
Feeling kind of spacious. How about you, Brian?
I don't know. Let's get into that. SpaceX. I don't know if this addressable market is large enough for me as an investor. I like to see some meat on the bone here. We're looking at 28.5 trillion in the S1. What do you think?
But 370 billion is for space. Everything else is the X factor.
The X factor. So let's break that down. We've got 370, 380 billion in space launch satellites, space economy. The other two are really focused on connectivity, the Starlink business of 1.6 trillion, and the rest of that all gets bucketed as AI,
Yeah.
orbital compute, space, data
Who,
centers in space.
who's eating who for lunch? It's kind of interesting.
It is. Well, just to put that in context, that addressable market is about 89% of the US GDP. So, yeah, I actually think it needs to be bigger. They need to go outside of the solar system and think about, intergalactic addressable market. So, go a little interstellar here. Like open your mind a little bit about how big this market could be.
Well, we might break the space-time continuum.
Yeah, so the point of this podcast is to kind of break it down, right? Like let's figure out, is this an investable idea? It's the ultimate FOMO perhaps of recent years. Getting in on SpaceX at the IPO, or should you wait? Is the pricing of the IPO a price that the market is going to welcome, or is there going to be an opportunity for investors to get in perhaps later at a different price that's potentially lower or higher? Who knows? But where do you want to start, Mike?
Why don't we start with what's for sale? I mean, what is SpaceX, right? We've kind of alluded to this already, but what are these three businesses and where are they at from a 2025 lens? And how does it map?
So that goes into the question of why now too, right? So Elon will tell you why now. They've only used their funding rounds for liquidity, but this is a funding round for investment, and he sees that there's a growth phase ahead of them. So they're raising up to $80 billion, approximately $80 billion to invest in the development of what is the growth phase, which is really orbital compute and data centers in space, and also the Starlink, which is really their arguably best business with connectivity and providing cellular and broadband services across the globe and addressing 2 billion potential people who might find that to be the best use of the best way to get connected. Also, he thinks that now that the space launch revenue is more stable, that this is providing the consistency in revenue that a public market company would want. But there's also some other things on the horizon I think that they're looking at. So, the unknowns in terms of the Cursor acquisition and the $80 billion or $60 billion rather, that they have an option to close that deal, how that gets structured. Maybe they need some cash for that. They do have some cash on the balance sheet. They have some debt with and some Bitcoin too. But I think you look at this is a company that investors are going to allow to be operating at losses and spending a lot of money because what they're trying to do is still looking like an early stage company, even though they've got this huge size. Do investors give them the benefit of the doubt to go build Elon's vision of these vertically integrated AI and compute and telecommunications and other things a company? So what do you think on that?
Yeah, I think it's important. This is very much a capital raise for the company's investment, right? This is not Elon selling shares. This is not employees selling shares. This is a capital raise, and this comes after in February of this year, in February 2026, SpaceX purchased XAI plus X, right? With X being, the property formerly known as Twitter.
And Colossus with their big data center.
Yeah, XAI. Right. So the first roll up was Twitter into XAI, and that's the Colossus data center. That's also what spawned things like Grok. But rolling all of those assets into the space company, which the space company has, in my view, been arguably Elon Musk's biggest success. arguably, I mean, certainly not in market cap on its own, but one might argue that it's a bigger success and more unique than his Tesla business.
Yeah, well, I think the point that you're trying to make, though, is that it was only February of 2026 that XAI got folded into SpaceX, and it was done at a $1.25 trillion valuation. Is that correct?
That's right. Yeah. So, you had different shareholders of SpaceX and you had different shareholders of XAI. And that 1.25, 1 trillion was SpaceX, 2.5 was XAI, inclusive of Twitter.
Right. So one of the things we need to cover is, so what we're here in early June, and we're getting ready for Friday's IPO. What's changed in a matter of 4 months that now the valuation is potentially, $600 billion higher, other than the fact that, there's been a couple of more SpaceX launches. It just seems to me that the window of opportunity is also there in terms of the market's excitement around AI. So that certainly plays into investor sentiment in terms of valuations and the pricing of the IPO. So the retail investor demand is certainly there, and they are making retail set aside a certain number of shares available to the retail market, which is kind of unique. And it's really, so the timing's super interesting, not just from that, but also where these businesses are. And maybe you couldn't script it any better, right? When in terms of Starlink has grown to 10 million subscribers, it's clearly showing that it's a very successful and scalable business. You have this idea that you could have orbital compute data centers in space, and it's at the same time that Starship is starting to look like it could be ready for reusability, full reusability. We haven't yet seen Starship land itself and be fully reusable, but we think it's on the near horizon, and that we need that payload to really to bring the ideas of these data centers, the racks in space that we envision for data center compute. And I think Elon's done a really good job of explaining why that makes a whole lot of sense, right? In terms of why it's better for 30% more sunlight that you could have on Earth. You don't have to lease land. You can have cooling, and you could deal with the radiation and heat dispersion much better, and then build a network of these so that you could have redundancies and all the things you can have, and then really build that into the Starlink so it fits in with the overall strategy. And not to mention the 10x cost reduction that you could potentially have in terms of, with Starship, in terms of its ability over even the Falcon 9 to get payloads to space. So it really, amazing timing here. And I fit in not just the business strategy timing and how effective they've been as capital allocators, but that fits in with timing of why now, because there's been some criticisms of Elon over the years. Why haven't you taken the company public sooner? Why you said you might wait for longer? I don't know. Maybe there's no perfect time. You go public when you can go public, and the market accepts you as a public company. Having worked in public company finance before, I'll tell you, you're going to want to know what your next 8 quarters looks like. And I think we're starting to see that there is predictability in the business and a cadence to their revenue, even though they're very different businesses, right? So all of the businesses are very different in terms of where they are and how they're growing. And so I'm just curious to see what the market's reaction will be to this as a public company.
Yeah, no, it certainly will be interesting that, the IPO valuation of 1.75 trillion. I think you have, yes, I agree with you 100%. It'll be interesting to see what the reception is, how much acceptance is. It sounds like the word on the street is they're already oversubscribed. And there was some discussion about whether they would reprice lower. That I think their bankers have said basically no. But it'll be interesting to see what day one pricing that, does it do what often happens in these IPOs, where there's, it's the pricing in the first couple of weeks is driven a little bit by demand and supply and who can sell, and insiders, I think, are locked up for a fair bit of time.
Yeah, they have 4 months of lockup. But I know you've done a lot of work on sort of the pricing of this. And so I want to kind of shift gears a little bit and talk about what you've what we've learned as analysts, right? So we're not just doing our own analysis. We're reading a lot of the important key opinion leaders out there, some very reputable companies, not just ones that are biased in terms of like the bankers in terms of explaining the valuation. And Professor Damodaran over at NYU was like very famously said, you could have guessed the valuation or the pricing rather with very little information because of course they were going to take what the pricing was in February and just, add
Uplift.
uplift a little bit. So like, what value are the bankers really providing except for, and arguably Elon Musk has as much reach as any of the banks in terms of driving interest in potentially the shares with his reach on X and his fame in general.
Absolutely, he's a master of the memes. I mean, his bankers, he has way more attention than any of his bankers do. Not only from retail. I mean, and it's interesting. Yeah, Professor Damodaran's valuation analysis. If you're seriously considering, if you're interested in this equity, whether you're bullish, bearish, or whatever, it's worth reading, listening to.
He's on YouTube and he's got a paper written and he's published on it and talks about it. And he's actually very level-headed in terms of his approach because he's looked not just on other hot IPOs in history like Uber and Facebook, now Meta, but he talks about the variability in terms of opinions on what the valuation could be. And so, his is basically in his view where the company was back in February, which is 1.25-ish trillion
Yeah.
in value. And the nuance of the math is looking at margins and you're looking at discount cash flows and you're looking at whether or not there's enough visibility to really give precision around the value. But what else did you learn from that research and in his approach to understanding how do you value a company as complex and as cutting edge as SpaceX?
It's developing your theory of the case, right? Which we've been discussing here on FOMO investing, but putting some numbers around it, right? So, what is the company's articulation of the total addressable market, and what do you really believe, right?
Well, you get you get the Musk factor, right? So Musk factor is a whole nother thing, but you have to give the guy credit because he has proven that he can execute on these grand visions. And it started, I would think, as these early SpaceX employees thinking about we are going to be multiplanetary. And then he's broken it down and said, okay, well, what are the steps that we have to go through to prove that we can do that? And so he's attracted talent. And that's, I think, one of his greatest gifts is to be able to attract talent, people that are passionate about the mission of the company. One of the comments that I read about SpaceX is that it's amazing how many competent people work there. They're really excited about the work that they do. They understand the vision. They understand their leadership position and the opportunity here. That said, I think what Professor Damodaran says is that a great company can be a terrible investment. And so he's looking at whether or not the stock falls after the IPO and maybe then it becomes a buy. But in my critique of that analysis is that if you looked at his examples, which is precisely valuing Meta, Facebook at the time, or Uber, both of those companies went on to create multiples on those IPO prices over time as they expanded the vision, the growth opportunities. And so, that could be somewhat here. I don't know that it's exactly it, but maybe it's not that important to thinking about the precision of $135 as the IPO price or whether it's $100 in his analysis.
Yeah, I mean it's buying value that makes sense to you. I think his examples of Meta and Uber is they did crash quite significantly post IPO, and you're correct. If you bought into the IPO and you held, across time, it's a fantastic investment. But we don't see the counterfactual, right? There's some survivorship bias in looking at Meta and Uber. I mean, another stock we talked about is Rivian. Arguably a failed IPO, but could be a great investment at this level, Like it doesn't always play out that across the fullness of time, across the long arc of a long, someone who's an investor who plays the long game, that the IPO price, it doesn't always turn out like Facebook and Uber, right? And is there real risk here? And this is where I think the valuation point, there's so many opinions here, right? Jim Chanos is on Twitter. Many very legitimate investors think this 1.75 trillion valuation is absolutely crazy for a company that had less than $19 billion in revenue in 2025. It is an insane multiple.
It is. So Jim Chanos is famously bearish on some of these companies. I would argue that, yeah, there's a probability set of likely outcomes here. And I like Morningstar's approach to this because they kind of look at it from, we see a 7% chance of a moonshot of really, this becoming, a really highly valued company. It's really, but more like a base case. And then they kind of look at, a bearish case. And in doing that, they come up with this consensus, sort of mixing all of those ingredients together to come up with a valuation of about $780 billion, which is a significant discount to basically almost half of what they will be going public at. And it's part of the overall just understanding the business. Now, I sort of don't agree with them in every single point, one of which is that they evaluate their moat, their competitive moat, as narrow. And I think that's not a fair way to look at it when you look at each business maybe independently. And maybe in AI currently today, it's a very competitive market, and it's still unproven that they can do what they want to do in terms of delivering orbital compute and data centers. But I'd argue that the Starlink business is very competitive. Arguably, could be much bigger than the currently addressable market that they've said. Potential less than $2 trillion. I think that could be much bigger when you look at the fact that they can service not just any human on Earth, but the need for broadband is ever increasing. And then, of course, the launch business, whether or not they just run that as essentially just an infrastructure to launch other businesses, and and then you can layer in all sorts of things with be imaginative here, right? So you can do space tourism, and we could be having vacations on the moon, and of course Mars. So some of that plays into this, and I don't know that you can sum it up with just one sort of thought and say that it is exactly this, but there's an enthusiasm around SpaceX that I think plays into all of this, and around Musk, and that really matters. To be honest with you, it does matter, and the market could give them 10 years of or more of credit to figure it out, and so maybe it doesn't matter, right? It doesn't matter if you want exposure to this type of company. This could be the vehicle to do that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, Musk Inc., being a Musk vehicle, as Damodaran puts it, is definitely a factor in pricing this business. So, take the hypothetical. Let's say, before IPO, if Musk steps away from the business, are they going to get 1.75 trillion? I would argue probably not.
Yeah. Yeah.
But that being said, Musk is a complicated guy. People love him or hate him, right? There is, after some of his, if one thing I think people will agree with, he's very ambitious, and he's ambitious across a lot of domains. And we live outside, a little outside of DC. There's a lot of folks in this area who have negative brand equity for the Elon Musk Incorporated, if you will.
Yeah. Well, that's because he did a little stint in the Trump administration trying to reform government, and that affected a lot of people in the DC area. He has an approach to problem solving that is polarizing for sure, and love him or hate him, he will be a trillionaire in less than a week's time. So, greatest, perhaps arguably the Thomas Edison of our time, the greatest entrepreneur on Earth. But I actually think at some level, even though he owns he'll own what 85% of the voting power in
I think
SpaceX.
that's a really important point and is related to this sort of Musk vehicle is he doesn't have that in Tesla, right? He doesn't have that in Tesla. His last round of executive compensation was challenged in Delaware, and they had to have a shareholder vote to confirm the last round. Yes, he has in this SpaceX IPO, he's going to have Class B shares that have 10x the voting power, which is about 85%, as you said, of the voting power vested in him. And so this is a license. This is a little atypical, but Zuckerberg also has something like 51% voting power and disproportionate voting power for his shares in Meta, right?
Yeah. So I guess the real question as an investor, does governments really matter all that much? I mean, that's a judgment call for every person, but you're not looking at this as a financial investment without considering the fact that you really aren't, we never really are as retail investors going to have much say in what goes on at the company level in terms of executive compensation. We expect that, independent auditors and independent board members can chime in on these issues. So you're really betting on his ability to execute. And the New York Times did a really interesting analysis of whether or not Elon Musk says something and that actually happens or whether it doesn't happen. And I think it's around 25%. I don't know the exact number offhand, that he says something and that actually happens. The next great tranche there is that it doesn't happen and on the time frame that he says. Now that's true of any company because we all have ideas that take much longer, right? There's the idea that you always think things take less time than they really do. And these are very complex engineering challenges that he's taking on. Now, today, in the SpaceX businesses and the AI businesses, they've all been private decisions that he's had to own and deal with without full disclosure to the market. Now, these are going to be very public things. And so, yeah, I think you're going to have to get comfortable with that. You're just going to, I feel like investors really need to just understand what this is and how Elon's control of capital allocation and decisions is going to just be God's word, if nothing else, right? If he wants to fold in XAI into SpaceX, he's going to do it. That's what he did, right? So there's no one to tell him he couldn't do that. It's now trying to take what looks like disparate businesses to those who haven't spent time on this, that now there's this unified vertical strategy and that there's an execution here to get those $26.5 trillion in AI addressable market or certainly make traction in that space when arguably their AI business is not bleeding edge, or it's maybe the fourth or fifth best company out there. Grok is sort of lagging, but they've I think he only said 6 months ago that they're rebuilding Grok in a new way. And what surprised Professor Damodaran was actually that they're hedging their bet here because they are leasing out, for example, Colossus. Since February, actually, they've done two big deals with Google and Anthropic to lease out compute to them, and so they're allowing competitors to come in and help build, which is their dreams and all of the various things to be multiplanetary. And this is really his he said it publicly, but this is how he's going to fund that vision is through the connectivity business, through the orbital data business.
Yeah, I think definitely a lot of what you're buying here is Elon Musk's stewardship, right? And with that comes the controlling the share disproportionate votes that his shares hold, right? Because and actually that's what's attractive about it as an investment is his ability. You cited, Brian, the New York Times study where he's right about 25% of the time. I think the other side of the coin of that is, the famous example is full self-driving, right? It's kind of like the boy who cried wolf on full self-driving. He's been shouting about that for many years, that it's around the corner, but he's changed his mind on it, right? He's changed Tesla's approach to full self-driving has fundamentally been rebuilt post the ChatGPT moment. And it's the ability of Elon to change his mind, which is ultimately his stewardship. That apart from the three businesses, that's a big part, I think, that is contained in the 1.75 trillion. You're actually paying a premium, in my estimation, to get access to Elon Musk's stewardship.
Yeah, and you listen to the the ultra bulls, whether it's Ark or Gavin Baker, who we've listened to, who's an exceptional technology analyst, and recently did an interview with the CFO, and they talk about what it means to invest in these big visions, right? And so, when you value in the Tesla space, what full autonomy means, or what robots means, and what is a measure of GDP in terms of, whether or not that's robotic or human contributions to, to output. I think that's part of this. So understanding why there's a bullish case even from here is part of this analysis. And so just talk about for example, Mick, like, what you've read in terms of the ultra bull case here as to where you think, SpaceX is going, and, potentially, some of the research that you've done on that.
Sure. So, I respect Gavin Baker. He's, as you say, a great technology analyst. He is a bull. He's invested in prior rounds privately, so he's biased. But the articulation there is it kind of relates to the core limiting factor in AI may ultimately be compute, right? And we're seeing this play out with the Google capital raise, right? Which is actually kind of interesting that they kind of went ahead of SpaceX, the Anthropic confidential IPO filing. All of this debt that different players have put on their books, all for the build out of AI. And you see this drama that's happening all over the United States, right? We live in Northern Virginia. There's a huge data center footprint in Northern Virginia, and this build out is not just NVIDIA chips. You need land, you need cooling, you need all of this stuff. And one solution to it is this orbital compute, right? And no one else has access to it, right? I mean, yes, there's Blue Origin is doing stuff in space, and there's other players in the private space market, but no one who's as advanced as SpaceX, in terms of actually having thousands of operating satellites that are servicing Starlink, which is a subscription business. Granted, it's small footprint in terms of subscribers, but they've had this success. And if the limiting factor in AI getting to super intelligence is compute, could orbital compute, these racks, when I first heard of this, a data center in space, and I was listening to a couple of different folks riffing on this. I mean, it's a huge, these data centers are huge. And I like how Gavin Baker puts it. It's actually not a data center in space, it's a rack in space.
Yeah, it's another constellation is in space. It's not that you're going to have, as he cites, a Pentagon-sized data center or one of these big ones that we see here in Northern Virginia that's 4 stories high and has various racks in it. You're really, and Elon Musk even talks about this, how it's going to be designed to fit inside Starship. So you're maybe looking at, I think Starship is 30 feet wide, and so but it's comparable to that. So if you look at Starlink, they're very small and they can fit into the Falcon 9, and they've launched 10,000 of those. Elon Musk sees that they're on target to launch 100,000 Starlink, and they have a useful life, arguably between 3 to 5 years. And they're just about to launch version 3. And version 3 is going to be a 10x capabilities improvement over the prior version. And as they retire the older versions, there's going to be this need. And so the cadence of the launches was 160 in 2025. Could you get in a bullish case? And this is a little bit of their own eating their own lunch. And I you have to know this as an investor, that 80% of their launches involve their own businesses, right? Or at least in recent years, they are doing defense, they are carrying other payloads and satellites, but they're launching their Starlink into space, and now they will be doing that with orbital data centers.
Or these racks in space, which
and Elon has a vision of having launches every day, potentially even every hour. But we're not yet to full reusability on the Starship. So we are on the Falcon 9. Well, not 100% full reusability, but you're almost there. And so bringing the cost down to be the, per metric ton of, or the cheapest to get to space will be their infrastructure play. And so that's the bet that is really, the super highway to space is what he's trying to build, the elevator to space. And then whatever you're putting into space, there's got to be a commercial demand for. And so currently there's the two. I think there's potentially other stuff, but that's
Yeah, I mean, for me, the bull case is actually quite simple, right? And it sort of rhymes a little bit with what shook out in the foundry market, right? So you had multiple players. Intel was in the lead. TSMC was kind of there, and then Intel didn't invest, and the marginal cost for TSMC, the sheer scale that they had, made them such a unique differentiator, right? I think in the AI space, compute, I mean, yes, you've got all these companies putting hundreds of billions of dollars into data center. If SpaceX has a tractable route to be the sole source supplier of the cheapest source of compute in the world, they could win the market, right? Just like TSMC kind of won the market in the foundry business. And so is that worth something? Yes, it's an option, right? It's an option, and it builds on the space launch business, which they have spent years, decades working on, and getting to a much lower cost of launch than anyone else, really, right?
yeah. And I think that the Starlink business and the orbital compute are so intertwined in terms of not only how the businesses will operate together. So, we should talk about that, but arguably the best business that they own is Starlink. And,
Hands down.
right. And so, one of the things we were talking about offline was, are they competing with AT&T and T-Mobile and these other cellular companies? I think you could have, whether they charge a few extra dollars for satellite access, and they partner with them, you could have it where, based on the needs of the consumer, whether you're talking of the voice or you need broadband and you need additional compute, you could have that link available to you, much in the way that you have potentially like your Wi-Fi on your phone that you could connect to higher broadband or something like that. So I think that actually the addressable market there is much bigger. But what they're trying to do is have, these the data centers, which there are some, it's not like they're inventing this. There are some things that they've tested out in terms of having orbital compute, but they would use lasers to transmit to Starlink to then send data down. That maybe there are use cases that will allow for the latency that is going to be natural with that. And couldn't you solve some of the latency issues around that? These are big problems to solve, but I think that, if anyone's going to solve it, it's going to be someone who's already got a constellation of very powerful telecommunication satellites that are already out in space. So it does fit together, right? These are not just they're not just inventing data centers in space and they're just going to be totally independent of Starlink. It's very much related. And I think that's an important point here, is that it's a natural progression of this. And so to manage, I think one of the reports I read, there could be, 3 to 5 constellations for connectivity for the Starlink types of low orbit communication satellites. There won't be 50, right? So there is going to be a certain number that creates critical mass and creates a competitive advantage there. That's an important point. They certainly are the leader here. China's going to do their own, or they are, planning to, and they're, certainly Blue Origin's trying to put connectivity satellites into space too. So there will be other commercial players here, but what they're doing is also next generation, which is to add the compute layer into space, and figure it out. So there will be failures, there will be delays potentially, and I think that you're right, where the appetite for compute is still scaling in such a way that we're seeing all of the AI infrastructure companies have had great appreciation in their stock price. Will there be constraints here, Mick? Like, where will the constraints be? Will it be in memory? Will it be in chips? Will it be, and that's something that I think as a vertically integrated company, Musk is thinking about. So, he's worried about these constraints and arguably some of the technical challenges that will be faced if there are any.
Look, I think the biggest risk to the bull case here, actually, there's a good bit. So Gavin Baker, the investor we were talking about, who was on with the CFO, did a podcast with Patrick O'Shaughnessy, and he's a big bull on SpaceX. He's a big bull on AI generally, and a lot of tech. But he acknowledges that the risk to his upside case is that the bitter lesson doesn't hold, right? That compute is not the ultimate constraint to artificial superintelligence. And there are people working on it. There are extremely smart, well-funded AI labs who think the current paradigm of, I'll call it brute force neural network approach to solving AI, which requires ever increasing amounts of compute, is the wrong way. The LLM approach, if you will, right? That could be the biggest risk to the bull theory of the case for this orbital compute segment. I mean, it's still a great business, as I think we've said. Kind of the connectivity business. There's a huge moat. It's not like it's not like some of those crypto scam projects that.
No, or companies that went public with dreams that never really materialized. So we are giving the company a lot of leeway in terms of painting the vision, which is why they're asking for $80 billion, because they're going to go execute on this growth phase to go do that. And how they spend the $80 billion is actually not 100% clear. I mean, they don't break it down in percentages or dollar amounts. It's across the businesses, and which businesses are going to require more capital, and will they be capital constrained even with $80 billion? Because $80 billion in these days when data centers are getting built all the time, and you've got Google raising $80 billion in the public markets when
they've got to pay $60 billion for Cursor, right?
Yeah, well, yeah, and they're but
if they do that deal, like they've got an out also.
Right, but this is an important point because they're only floating, 3% of the stock potentially in the public markets, which is it's very small, and we won't even get into it. But there's a whole discussion around, how much of a company should be public to in order to be included in indexes, and just to put some of the rumors out there that the S&P wouldn't even look at including them unless they were net income gap positive and had been a public company for a year. The Nasdaq index 100 index, they are considering a 15-day public company window in order to be included. But it's not like this passive market has to rush out and go buy it. So it's going to be, I think, pretty stable from that perspective. There will be funds that feel like they need to own it and need to have exposure to it. This is the largest IPO in the U.S. markets that we've seen, and certainly one of the most important in the last several decades. And so there's this concern over the absorption of the shares. And just to make the point, so when these companies go public at a lower valuation, call it $1 billion, for example, there's this thought that if it's a traditional IPO, that the bankers are there to help support the stock when they go public, right? And they're market makers, and they're trying to balance the order book and try to make it stable. This is so big, I don't think that's really the playbook here, right? JP Morgan and Goldman Sachs are not going to be supporting the shares, the $135 price start. I mean, it's a $1.7 trillion company. They don't have the balance sheet to do that.
Yeah, I think Damodaran said they can support it. Like they don't have the capital to.
It's not part of the plan. So, Mick, why don't you leave us with some final thoughts on sort of questions about the IPO that we should be thinking about? We're just a couple of days away here from getting to market. What should investors be thinking about?
Look, I think you've got to develop your own valuation here. I think, is Musk a premium? Is Musk a discount? If Musk is a discount for you, obviously pass. Right, it's hard pass. If based on your estimation, he has a non-trivial chance of doing something unique, given this opportunity, given this check for $80 billion in his stewardship, and past performance is no guarantee. You've got to look at the financials. You've got to look at what you believe Starlink is worth, what you believe space is worth, and do you believe I mean, what do you believe about AI? I think enmeshed in your investment decision, you have to have a theory about the direction of AI and the broader market. And does it give SpaceX a unique opportunity?
Now, these are all, I mean, these are really good points, Mick. I think most investors are betting on the theme and they're looking at the theme of Musk and space and the opportunity. And these are big numbers. And what does it all mean in terms of a discounted cash flow model? I don't know if that anyone, except for the few that are very analytical, will be doing those things. So I think it's important to think about it and also to read what others and other have put out there. But at the end of the day, I think why do you invest in something? It's because you believe that this is the future, right? There's 100,000 ways to make and lose money, but if you get excited about this and learning about this and this space and SpaceX and all of the businesses that they are in, and you want to be excited to tell your grandkids that you were involved with the IPO of this company when we do settle on Mars, and maybe the stock price is exactly the same as it is today. Maybe it's different. Maybe the vision is much bigger. Maybe it is actually around a $1.75 trillion opportunity. I think you're going to be feeling that you're invested in the story as much as you're invested in the financial outcome of your money that's in the market. Because people are excited about space. They're excited about the story, and you can weather the ups and downs of the market because that's not really that important to you. What's important to you is that you're going to be holding this company for 10, 20 plus years, and you say that this is makes you excited as an investor, makes you more interested in learning more about the company. And I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. So there's potentially a spot for you for this in your portfolio, whether it's getting access to those shares at $135 or how it trades on the first few days, up or down or whatever. I mean,
Yeah.
I don't know. I think it's one of those cases where you're going to bring in a different type of investor who's just not looking so much at the day to day. They're looking at the long term vision.
So where are you, Brian, at the 1.75 trillion? Are you buy, sell short, or pass?
No, I don't think those are the only options. I think this is something I'm very interested in following. I don't feel like I have an edge to get a unique perspective on this. I've read a lot of research, and we both have. Where I tend to focus is where I think I can understand a consensus view better than other people, and I don't know that I can do that here. I don't have the technical background to understand all of the how data centers in space could work. I can conceptualize and can see that other smart people can figure that out. And there's going to be engineers that can figure out the building blocks to get us there. And so I kind of like the underfollowed stories, as you know, Mick. So I'm an astute observer, which I think is not one of the options you mentioned, but it's the one that I'm most interested
No,
in.
no, 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 no.
Well, also like Professor Damodaran is if this is a failed IPO, maybe I'm more interested.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Absolutely. Astute observer was not one of my options, but is a completely valid option. I think that's a good way to put it. It's probably not far from where I'm at, in terms of valuation. Part of me screams a little bit like Jim Chanos. This is crazy.
Yeah, these are such big numbers. It's really hard to get your head around what a trillion means anyway. And so that's definitely part of this is that Nassim Taleb talks about the fragility of large numbers and things that are big because falling down is much easier than accelerating upwards. And so I don't know. There are a few companies out there, and I won't get into this, but as a final thought, that we are in a world where the big companies are getting much bigger, and I think that there are certain companies that you can see as $10 trillion companies. Potentially, this is one of them. And if you're looking for a company that can go for 1.75 trillion, you can paint the picture to two launches a day and three launches a day and all of this infrastructure, and the AI thesis totally plays out, and the compute demand continues to be there, and the supply side is stable. Sure,
Yeah.
this could be a $10 trillion company.
Yes, absolutely.
So there's very little precision, but we hope we gave investors and FOMO investors a little taste of our thoughts on this, and a little bit, perhaps the greatest story of FOMO of all time. Are we going to land this valuation vertically, Mick? What other funds you got?
I don't know.
We're
So
going orbital.
you got to see if this is Interstellar or Project Hail Mary. I don't know which one it is,
Oh,
but
there you go. Both were good movies, so we'll perhaps end it on that. So yeah, let's keep watching the story and see what happens on Friday, and maybe we'll revisit sort of a postmortem of what actually happens post the IPO.
sounds good.
All right, take care, Mick.
But as always, take care, Brian.